The SPAD-13 was not America's own homegrown opening act, but it was one of the machines that carried the United States into modern air combat. By the time American pilots were flying it, the airplane had already been hardened by the Western Front. It was fast for its day, structurally tough, and far more mature than the earliest warplanes. That matters because the first real chapter of United States fighter history did not begin with America setting the standard. It began with America trying to catch up to one. The P-26 Peashooter feels like America's first real step into the modern fighter era. It was an all-metal monoplane, which already made it look like the future compared with the biplanes that came before it. At the same time, the open cockpit, fixed landing gear, and old-school details gave away the truth. One foot was in the new age, the other was still stuck in the old one. In combat terms, it would be outgrown quickly. In historical terms, it was the doorway. The F3F was the last fully mature expression of the United States Navy biplane fighter. It was nimble, carrier-capable, and polished in the way only a late-generation design can be. But it also arrived right at the moment when the entire biplane era was dying. The Navy had finally figured out how to make this kind of aircraft work at sea, and just as it did, the world moved on to monoplanes. The F3F did not open the future. It closed the past. The P-36 Hawk looked much more like a real modern fighter than the aircraft that came before it. It was cleaner, more coherent, and much closer to what people now picture when they think of a pre-war fighter. The problem was timing. By the time full-scale war arrived, the pace of aviation had already jumped again. The P-36 never became the star of the war, but it helped prove that American fighter design was finally getting serious. The P-38 Lightning looked unusual because it was unusual. Twin engines, twin booms, long range, concentrated firepower. This was not a conventional answer to the fighter problem. It was America trying to build something big, fast, heavily armed, and capable of doing difficult work at long distances. In Europe, pilots did not always love it under every condition. In the Pacific, where range mattered and long overwater missions were normal, the P-38 became exactly the kind of weapon it had been built to be. It was never the standard sort. It was a specialized heavy blade. The P-39 Airacobra is one of the best reminders that radical does not always mean right. Putting the engine behind the pilot made it look futuristic, and the airplane still gets remembered because that layout was so different. But battlefield reputation is built on results, not novelty. The P-39 had some strengths at lower altitude, and it definitely had character, yet it never became the ideal all-around American fighter people once hoped it might be. Its place in history is not pure failure and not pure success. It is the record of an ambitious idea that never quite became the answer. The P-40 Warhawk was not America's best fighter of World War II. It was the fighter that had to hold the line before the best ones arrived. That is why it matters. In China, North Africa, and the early Pacific War, the P-40 showed up because it was available, rugged, and ready. Its ceiling was obvious. It was not a high-altitude superstar, and the longer the war went on, the more its limitations showed. But when the war began hitting fast and hard, the P-40 was one of the airplanes that kept the opening chapter from collapsing. The P-43 Lancer is the kind of airplane people forget because it looks like a stepping stone, and that is exactly what it was. You can see America reaching for better altitude performance and a more modern fighter concept, but the design never matured into a true frontline answer. It was overtaken quickly. On its own, the P-43 leaves only a faint impression. In the larger development line, though, it matters because later aircraft did not emerge out of thin air. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of the heaviest-hitting American fighters of the war, and it looked the part. Big, tough, heavily armed, and able to absorb punishment, it was never the elegant duelist type. It was a brute with altitude performance, firepower, and stamina. In combat, those qualities paid off again and again. The P-47 could escort, it could dive, it could strafe, and it could take damage that would kill lighter aircraft. A lot of fighters are remembered for grace. The P-47 is remembered for force and survival. The P-51 Mustang changed more than tactical air combat. It changed the shape of the air war itself. America did not just need another good fighter. It needed a long-range escort that could stay with bombers deep into enemy territory and back again. That is where the P-51 rewrote the story. It brought together range, speed, high-altitude performance, and maneuverability in a way that finally made deep escort practical on a sustained basis. Plenty of aircraft won battles. The P-51 helped change the strategic equation. The P-61 Black Widow pushed the American fighter story into the night. It was not a daytime fighter doing a side job. It was built from the start around night interception and radar-guided combat. That gave it a very different identity from the classic daylight fighters that dominate most war stories. It never had the same public legend as the major escort and air superiority machines. But once the subject turns to night fighting, radar, and specialized interception, the P-61 stands alone as a true pioneer. The P-63 Kingcobra feels like the final attempt to rescue the line that began with the P-39 Airacobra. It was more refined, more mature, and better sorted out than its predecessor. It just arrived in a world that had already moved on. America never made it into a frontline centerpiece, and it lived more on the edges than at the center of the war. That gives the P-63 a strange aftertaste. It was not badly made. It was simply born too late to change the story. The F2A Buffalo holds a real place in United States naval aviation history because it was the Navy's first monoplane fighter. That status matters. So does the reputation that came with it. The Buffalo showed that the Navy had stepped into the modern era, but it also exposed how wide the gap could be between looking modern and actually being mature in combat. It was an important beginning, not a comfortable one. The F4F Wildcat was the fighter that absorbed punishment in the hardest phase of the Pacific War and refused to let the sky fall incompletely. It was not the fastest or the most dominant-looking airplane in the theater. What it had was toughness, reliability, and the ability to work from carriers under brutal conditions. Pilots learned how to use it to survive and fight effectively, and that mattered because the Wildcat was there before better answers fully arrived. It did not win fame by overwhelming the enemy. It earned respect by standing its ground. The F4U Corsair looked like a legend before it ever earned the title. The bent gull wings alone made it unforgettable. Once it got into combat, the speed, firepower, and attack capability gave that dramatic shape real substance. Early carrier operation, though, was not clean and effortless. The Corsair had to work through handling and deck landing problems before it became the fearsome machine people remember. That struggle is part of what gives it its edge. The F4U was not a perfect hero from day one. It had to fight for its own reputation. The F6F Hellcat was not the most romantic airplane in the Pacific. It was the most useful at scale. Easy to build, easier to train on, reliable in service, and well-matched to carrier warfare. The Hellcat looked less glamorous than some of its peers and more like an industrial answer to a massive naval war. That is exactly why it became so important. The F6F did not need to be the most dramatic machine in the sky. It needed to keep delivering sortie after sortie, battle after battle, and it did. The F8F Bearcat feels like the final sharp exclamation point of the piston-engine carrier fighter era. It was lighter, more aggressive, and designed around a Navy that had learned exactly what it wanted by the end of the war. The trouble was not the airplane. The trouble was the calendar. The jet age was already arriving. That is why the Bearcat carries such a distinct sense of timing gone wrong. It was not too weak. It was too late. The F-1 Phantom mattered because it turned the phrase jet carrier fighter from an idea into something real. That did not mean it was some unbeatable marvel. It was an early naval jet, full of compromises and limitations, because operating jets from carriers was a much harder problem than operating them from land. The F-1 was important because there was no going back after it. Once the Navy crossed that line, the piston era was living on borrowed time. The F-80 Shooting Star did not just flirt with the jet age. It put the United States into it for real. This was a jet fighter that moved beyond experimentation and into quantity, service, and combat use. That is why the F-80 carries so much weight in the timeline. From this point on, the future of American fighters was no longer a question of whether jets would matter. The question was how quickly everything else would have to change around them. The F-82 twin Mustang looked like a stubborn refusal to let the piston era die quietly. It resembled two Mustangs fused together, but it was built around real operational demands: long range, long endurance, and all-weather capability. Its problem was that the jet age was already closing the window on aircraft like it. That gives the F-82 its strange appeal. It was not just an odd-looking machine. It was an entire era trying to stay relevant a little longer. The F-84 Thunderjet represented the point where jet fighters stopped being interesting mostly because they were fast and started proving they could do the hard, repetitive work of war. America needed more than speed. It needed an aircraft that could handle attack missions, frontline tempo, and sustained operations. In Korea, the F-84 became known less for glamorous dogfight mythology and more for the grind of real combat tasks. That practicality is exactly what makes it important. The F-86 Sabre gave the jet age its first iconic American face. Swept wings, high speed, high-altitude combat, and jet versus jet fighting all came together in a way people could instantly recognize. Korea turned the Sabre into more than just a capable airplane. It turned it into the machine that made jet combat feel real to the public imagination. The legend can sometimes make it sound too perfect, but the reason the F-86 matters is not because it floated above history. It is because it showed America how the new kind of air combat actually had to be fought. The F-94 Starfire came out of a very Cold War kind of fear. The enemy would not wait for daylight and clear weather. That pushed radar, two-seat operation, and all-weather interception to the front of the fighter mission. The F-94 was never going to be remembered as a romantic dogfighter. It was a specialist. But that was the point. It marked the moment when the fighter was no longer just a clear-sky hunter. It was also a round-the-clock sentry. The F9F Panther was one of the first United States Navy jet fighters that felt truly settled into frontline reality. It was not wildly futuristic in the way some early jets tried to be. It was stable, practical, and useful, which mattered more. In Korea, it helped prove that naval jet fighters were no longer just experiments looking for a mission. They were becoming routine tools of war. The F-100 Super Sabre marked America's move into the supersonic era as a matter of normal business, not occasional spectacle. That leap brought prestige, but it also brought real problems in handling, safety, and operational complexity. Later in Vietnam, the F-100 found itself doing more strike and support work than glamorous fighter mythology might suggest. That is part of its real significance. It did not just symbolize speed. It showed that speed alone solved nothing. The F-101 Voodoo feels like a physical expression of early Cold War uncertainty. It was born with one mission in mind and then pulled toward others, including interception and reconnaissance, because the strategic picture kept shifting. Fast, powerful, and unmistakably of its era, the F-101 never feels like the final answer to a clear question. It feels like a high-performance platform drag through a period when America itself was still figuring out what it most needed from a fighter. The F-102 Delta Dagger made missile-age air defense into a distinct identity. This was not an airplane built around classic turning combat. It was built around the idea of intercepting hostile bombers as part of a larger defense network. The Delta Wing, the all-weather mission, and the emphasis on guided weapons all pushed it away from traditional fighter romance and towards something colder and more systematic. The F-102 was a gatekeeper in the sky. The F-104 Starfighter turned speed obsession into airplane form. Thin, sharp, and missile-like, it looked as if the age believed velocity itself could solve the problem of air combat. That gave it one of the most striking silhouettes in fighter history. It also made it a very demanding machine with a narrow comfort zone. The F-104 was never the safe, balanced, all-purpose answer. It was a dramatic bet placed on the idea that faster might mean better. The F-105 Thunderchief carried a fighter designation but lived much of its life like a heavy strike hammer. It was born in a Cold War nuclear context and then thrown into Vietnam for extremely dangerous conventional attack work. Big, fast, and able to carry a punishing load, the F-105 did not look or behave like a nimble duelist. It looked like a machine built to punch through hell and keep going. That is why its legacy feels so heavy. A lot of it was forged under some of the most punishing combat conditions of the era. The F-106 Delta Dart feels like the peak of the American interceptor mindset. Detection, guidance, interception, weapon release. Everything about it was pushed toward a cleaner, more automated, more specialized air defense role. It was not a universal fighter for every age. It was a highly refined guardian built for one very specific sky. That is what gives the F-106 its identity. It was not trying to be everything. It was trying to be the best possible door lock. The F-7U Cutlass was a Navy gamble that looked like the future and paid for that ambition with paying. Its shape alone announced that it wanted to leap ahead, but the technology was not mature enough to let that leap land cleanly. What survives around the Cutlass is not the story of a stable success. It is the story of risk, experimentation, and the price of trying to grab tomorrow too early. The Navy had several beautiful near misses in that period. The F-7U is one of the clearest. The F-8 Crusader felt like a throwback warrior inside the missile age. It was fast, carrier-capable, and still carried the spirit of gun combat in a period when too many people were starting to imagine that close-range fighting had become obsolete. That gave the F-8 its edge. It was not clinging to the past because it was behind the times. It was preserving a hard truth the future-minded crowd was too eager to forget. That is why it was remembered as the last of the gunfighters. The F4 Phantom II may be the single clearest embodiment of American fighter thinking in the Middle Cold War. The Navy wanted it. The Air Force wanted it. The Marines wanted it. It was fast, heavy, long-ranged, missile-armed, and multi-role, which made it look like a machine that could carry the whole age on its back. In Vietnam, it proved enormously adaptable, but it also exposed the era's blind spots with brutal clarity. Missiles were not magic. Close combat had not disappeared, and pilot training could not be treated as secondary. The F-4 was so successful that it became the vehicle through which America relearned what it had started to forget. The F-5E Tiger II sits in a strange place in United States fighter history. It was not the great heavyweight champion of the American frontline, but it had real staying power in export service, training, and aggressor roles. Light, agile, relatively affordable, and easy to maintain, the F-5E thrived in places where a larger, more expensive fighter would have been the wrong answer. It never carried kingly swagger. It did not need to. Its talent was endurance. The F-14 Tomcat was the United States Navy's Cold War fleet defense anxiety made magnificent. The carrier battle group needed protection far from the ship, which meant radar reach, long-range interception, and heavy weapons all had to come together in one aircraft. Variable sweep wings and the Phoenix missile system gave the F-14 exactly that kind of over-the-horizon menace. It was also complex, expensive, and notoriously demanding to support. That mix is exactly why the Tomcat became a legend. It was powerful, dramatic, and never cheap in any sense of the word. The F-15C Eagle was the Air Force's answer after Vietnam to the question it should never have stopped asking: how do you win the air battle first? This was a fighter built with that mission at the center, not as a side effect. Powerful, stable, intimidating, and uncompromising in its focus on air superiority, the F-15C looked like an institution correcting itself. It carried none of the uncertainty of the earlier period. It was the Air Force saying it had learned the lesson and intended not to lose the sky again. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is one of the clearest examples of a supposed supporting player turning into a star. It began life as the lighter side of a high-low mix, but maneuverability, multi-role flexibility, and a lower cost of operating at scale gave it a very long runway in history. The F-16 never needed the heavy aura of a larger fighter to become important. It grew into importance by being useful, adaptable, and sustainable over time. That is why it ended up feeling less like a backup and more like a defining aircraft in its own right. The A-18C Hornet represented a major shift in naval thinking. The idea was no longer to divide combat aircraft into increasingly narrow specializations if one platform could handle both fighter and attack roles well enough. That is right there in the name. The Hornet was not built to be a Cold War myth machine like the Tomcat. It was built to be balanced, dependable, and practical over long service. In a real military, that kind of usefulness becomes its own form of power. The F-15EX Eagle looked like an extension of the F-15C Eagle, but it became something much more distinct. The logic was simple. If the Eagle platform was this good, why not turn it into a heavy, long-range, all-weather strike aircraft without throwing away its combat edge? That is how the F-15E became one of America's most formidable dual-role fighters. It was not just a variant with extra chores. It was a heavy hitter built on a champion's bones. The F-A-18E Super Hornet was the Navy's answer to a post-Cold War reality in which beauty and mystique were less important than reliability, sustainability, and multi-role flexibility at sea. The F-14 Tomcat may have been more cinematic, but the Super Hornet was easier to support, more practical across a wider range of daily missions, and adaptable enough to absorb additional jobs like buddy tanking. It never needed to win a charisma contest. It won by being the airplane the fleet could live with. The F-22 Raptor raised the standard for air superiority into a new generation. Stealth, supercruise, sensor awareness, and high-end performance all came together in a way that made older definitions of fighter excellence feel incomplete. The challenge in writing about the F-22 is that its power is not mostly built on a huge pile of public combat footage. Its power is in the standard it sets. It is expensive, scarce, and impossible to field in endless numbers. But that scarcity is part of the story. The F-22 feels less like a routine combat aircraft and more like a warning about the level of fight the other side would have to survive. The F-35A Lightning II was never meant to become famous as a classic dogfight idol. Its real strength lies in seeing first, identifying first, sharing first, and fitting into a wider combat network before weapons are ever released. That makes it feel very different from older fighters built around speed and turning performance as their public face. It has lived under a permanent magnifying glass. Development controversies, cost debates, doubts about timelines, doubts about priorities. Yet all the arguing around it never changed the central fact. The F-35A kept becoming more central to the future force even while people were still debating whether it deserved to. The F-35B Lightning II is what happens when fifth-generation combat capability gets forced into Marine Corps expeditionary logic. Big fixed bases are not the whole story for that service, so short takeoff and vertical landing are not party tricks here. They are the reason the aircraft exists. That comes with complexity and cost, and it always will. But move the scene to amphibious assault ships, rough forward locations, and dispersed operations, and suddenly the strange version becomes the most useful one. The F-35B makes sense precisely because it does not fit the standard mold. The F-35C Lightning II marks the Navy's entry into the fifth-generation carrier era. Carrier decks are not ocean versions of Air Force runways. The demands are different, the stresses are different, and the operating rhythm is different. That is why the F-35C, though part of the same family as the other two F-35 variants, follows a distinctly naval logic. Bigger wings, stronger landing gear, and carrier-focused design choices make it more than a sea-based copy. It is the Navy's own answer to stealth-age carrier warfare. The F-15EX Eagle II says something important about how America sees the future. It is not betting everything on a single type of fighter. Fifth-generation aircraft matter, but the Air Force still wants a heavily armed, long-range, highly usable platform that can replace aging Eagles quickly and carry serious loadouts without apology. That is why the F-15EX exists. It is not there to prove the stealth era wrong. It is there to prove that even in the stealth era, some old bones are still too strong to throw away. The F-111 Aardvark wore a fighter designation, but in spirit it belonged much more to the world of high-speed, low-level, long-range strike warfare. Born out of the complicated TFX program, it carried ambitious ideas about joint solutions and advanced technology, and not all of those ideas worked for everyone involved. What did work, especially for the Air Force, was a fast, terrain-following attack platform with real punch. The F-111 sat inside the fighter sequence by name, while living most of its life somewhere else entirely. The F-117 Nighthawk may be the clearest example of an aircraft that sounds like a fighter on paper and feels like something else in combat. Its strength was never air combat maneuvering. It was stealth, penetration, and the ability to reach high-value targets without being seen until it was too late. Look at it through the lens of a traditional fighter, and it does not fit. Put it into the evolution of modern air warfare, and it suddenly looks like one of the earliest aircraft to drag the future into the present.